Hey everyone, how are you doing? This is Benny Lewis. If you're watching this in the replay on YouTube afterwards, just scroll down and we will have a list of all of the topics we discussed today, so you can catch up on that. But otherwise, welcome to everybody watching this live. I look forward to all your questions, and today we're tackling just general language learning questions. I wanted to make sure I satisfied any of your queries this day, because the rest of the week I got some other cool videos coming and I wanted to keep those on topic. So today it's a free-for-all. Whatever is on your mind, you can hit me with it. All right, so we have our moderator that you can see just mentioned up here, Holly, and she's going to be passing me along the questions, and otherwise I will pick whatever looks most interesting. And so let's see, just as we were waiting, we had Cassie. You might be able to hear Shatsy barking in the background, as well as general New York noise. So just before we started, Cassie had asked, I can't roll my R's, how do I do that? So I would say that the easiest way is that it depends. There are two types of like R rolls, as it were. The trilled R is a little trickier. I won't be able to give a very brief or useful answer for that. In general, I've felt that relaxing my tongue as I blew like above it helped me get that sound. But if you look up YouTube videos about how to roll your R, you'll actually get native speakers explain that in much better detail, as well as people who have experience explaining mouth formations. So definitely look that up if you can. And otherwise, I would say for the single tap door, a trick I always tell people is to think of the words la, L-A, and da, D-A, and say them very quickly. La, da, la, da. And then when you do that as fast as you can, la, da, la, da, la, da, you'll notice that your tongue is moving like this. It's in the front of your mouth, la, and then back a bit, da. And the single R that you would use, like in the Spanish word caro, is kind of like it's halfway between the two. So it's like calo, cado, calo, cado, calo, cado, caro. And that's the easiest way to get to that letter as a native English speaker. There are lots of other methods. We also have a similar sound in the word butter, if you say it with an American accent. Okay, I would actually say butter, more like that. Okay, so over on Facebook, we have a couple of questions. So let's see what I can do here. Marcus says, do you mind if I ask what levels you would say your current languages are? Yeah, that's a good question. So it's always very tricky to to self-evaluate what your language level is. And in my case, one of my issues that you guys who've been following me like on these videos and so on would know over the last couple of years is that writing the 4 books that I was writing, which were about language learning, but they were about the absolute beginning stages of language learning, it meant that I was more focused on writing the books than practicing. So the level that I would have been at when I first got to New York about 2.5 years ago would not be the same as the level that I'm at now. Like for instance, I got a C2 diploma in Spanish, recognized by around the world as an official recognition of your level, but I wouldn't say I have that level now because my Spanish would have slipped through lack of practice. So I would say generally the languages I practice the most would still be in the C levels, but at the C1 level, and this would be Spanish and French for sure, and possibly Esperanto because of how expressive I can be in that language. Although if I wanted to say more confidently, I'd say B2 for that. And then my German was very close to C2 when I sat the exam and passed 4 out of 5 sections of that. But through lack of practice, I'd say that slipped not just to C1 but to B2. And so one of the projects I'm going to be having this year, before I get on to my next language learning project, which I haven't decided on yet, so I know it's usually a question is what's your next language. But before I get to that, I'm going to complete my time management project, which I'll be talking about tomorrow. So make sure to check that out next live video. Yes, hello New York and your car horns. But as well as the like time management project. Once I finish that, my next project is to maintain my languages, and that's kind of going to be seeing where they currently are and get them up to a proper level, and to be aware of where they are, because through lack of practice the level that you would have would go down a notch a little bit, and it's kind of hard to self gauge that if you're not actively practicing the language. Fortunately, that's been changing the last couple of weeks, but I want to like have more consistency, and then I'll be very happy to give you a more useful answer for that. All right, so next, Roger says, are there any daily news sources available in English then translated into German? Okay, interesting question. I think the most likely source you're going to get for that is Deutsche Welle. So that's dw.de or .com, I forget which one. And they have news in simple German. They have news in normal German, and they also have English. And this is the great thing about this website, is it's very much tailored to German learners. But it's possible there are bilingual news sources. So if that's the case, then anyone who's here, please do share that in the comments. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but someone might be able to come in for that. But otherwise, I would recommend Deutsche Welle. And keep in mind, news, that is one way to get your language practice, but there's a lot of really good bilingual texts that I'm sure you can find. There's lots on Amazon. I know for a fact when I searched for their German content, I did find things like Alice in Wonderland, for instance. I found it like on my Kindle, one page in English, one page in German, or vice versa. And that's one way to read, and it's kind of a nice bulky book to get into. I would say definitely use news to help you, but you don't have to worry about making it bilingual all the time. Maybe just read the German version and make it so you're finding simplified German. And that is something that you'll find on the Deutsche Welle website. Okay. Let's see. Question from Holly. What's the difference between aún and todavía in Spanish? I think it's pretty much like the difference between still and yet in English. There's more to it than that, but one you use with a negative, or no, sorry, that's how we translate it backwards to English, is we would use the not yet, but I think that's one reason. Can't off the top of my head remember the exact precise usage, so maybe someone else can say that, but I think it's something along the lines of still and yet. Okay. Now, Andy Roberts, great to see you again. Over on YouTube, he's asking, how do you learn languages with a lot of exceptions? Irregular verbs or case endings, like Russian? Very good question. Okay, so the experience I would have with this, that would be the most similar to your situation, would be when I dabbled in Czech for a couple of months. And there are lots of case ending differences. And when it comes to irregular verbs, I'd say Spanish kind of does have its mixture of verbs that kind of branch off from the normal patterns. And what I would highly recommend for that, especially for the beginning stages, is to find the most basic patterns, to learn them first, and then to apply that to verbs even when you know that it's not going to be the case all the time. It's okay to make those mistakes, and I think that's like I remember when I started speaking some Czech and I completely and utterly butchered the language. Obviously, it's you know, you're not going to reach the stage of having complex conversations or even eloquent conversations about basic topics in your first weeks of learning it. But I was able to communicate myself, and people were having conversations with me, and they actually told me I sounded like I spoke the language better than someone who had been learning for years and was so distracted to get every single verb right that they weren't speaking a lot. So they just came across as less skilled. So firstly, I would say learn those basics and try to apply that to as much as possible. Don't get too distracted with the exceptions. This is a kind of an implementation of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, where you learn the 20% that gives you 80% of the results. Or 80% of the time is correct. So that's what I would say initially. But then when you want to tidy it up, so in the case of like verbs, irregular verbs in Spanish, for instance, they branch off from the main pattern, but there are still further patterns. So for instance, instead of learning them on an individual case, because that is very time consuming, I would still try to find patterns. So in Spanish, for instance, I could have learned that a verb like contar, when I'm conjugating that, I say yo cuento, tú cuentas, and so on, and like just learn it for that verb and then learn it for the next verb as it comes up. But in fact, there is a pattern there, and generally a good grammar book will explain this to you. I am a big fan of Harrop's. I know I've got the Harp Spanish somewhere back there. And what I learned from that is what's actually happening is it's about where the accent stress is. So in contar, anyone who knows Spanish knows that when you end a verb with, or any word, when you end any word with a consonant, that consonant tends to get the syllable stress unless it's an N or an S. So contar means you're getting the stress on the second syllable, contar. So that O isn't getting stressed and it stays as an O. But then you are stressing it when you say cuento, because that ends in an O, and they don't like to stress the O in the majority of cases in Spanish. So because of that, the O morphs into a UE, and instead of conto, it's cuento. And then that pattern continues, so that it's not that everything the O's become we in the present form of the verb, it's that it's when it's stressed. So you think of we count, that's actually contamos, not cuentamos, because it's contamos, because that is the second to last syllable, since it ends in an S, and that means you don't actually stress that last one. So I know that's kind of technical explanation, but anyone who's learning Spanish and finds like it feels random, you'll actually see that pattern helps you to learn quite a lot of words. You'll see that it's where the stressed syllable is. And if you're at an intermediate stage, you'd be up for that. I think as a beginner, you don't want to worry about that too much. That's quite a lot of information that I just gave that is more likely to prevent you from speaking. So that's what I'd say when it comes to verbs and when it comes to case endings. What I said before with I would use the nominative, the one that tends to be in the dictionary, the majority of the time, and see how it tends to change and try to apply that, and then see the patterns. So sometimes the patterns are harder to find, but there are patterns. It usually depends on the spelling of the word, not the meaning of the word. You know, it's the same with how things tend to be assigned masculine or feminine. It's not that the I don't know, la chaise in French, it's not that the chair has atoms that are wearing little pink dresses that make it feminine. It's that it ends in that letter combination SE, which more often than not tends to be a feminine word. So you start to see these patterns. That really makes a difference. So I wanted to make sure I answered that question more in depth. Hopefully that helps people. So next one here we got Andre Petrash on YouTube. I'm having a hard time improving my listening skills in German, and I don't like listening to the radio all the time. Passive listening is not something I enjoy. How do you do that learning German? Yeah, I cannot recommend passive listening. In fact, I tested this out when I was sitting, I literally just mentioned. I sat the C2 exam in German and I passed 4 out of 5 sections. The 5th section that I failed was the listening section. And the reason that a very, very big reason that I failed it is that I thought having the radio on in the background, like all day long, would ultimately like boost my listening skills in German. But I wasn't actually listening to it. I was maybe writing a blog post, or maybe I was doing another exercise in German that helps some other aspect of the language. So definitely cannot recommend listening to the podcasts. Listening to the radio. But I do recommend podcasts for that. So there are learning podcasts that are made to help you improve your listening comprehension skills. So if you, Holly can share a link with you there to a list of the podcasts that we recommend on Fluent in 3 months. And if you check that out, you'll see any language that you're likely to be learning. German, of course, is among them. And when you are using that kind of system, what they do is they speak very slowly in the initial stages, and they kind of break apart the basic conversations. And at the start of the lesson, you don't understand that you hear this dialogue, whether it be 10 seconds or maybe a minute long when you're at a higher level. And at the start, you don't understand what they're saying, but then they explain it, they expand on it, they break the little pieces up, and by the end of the lesson, you understand it. And this is kind of a more nitty-gritty way of improving your listening comprehension skills. So that for me personally has been the best way to improve my listening skills. You guys can probably hear a little squeaky toy. That is Shatsy playing with his hedgehog that he likes to squeeze. He's a funny guy. And I call him a guy. He's a dog. Okay, so next question is from Steve Bickles on YouTube. I'm trying to study Polish, but finding it very difficult and keep going back to Brazilian Portuguese as I feel I have more connection with Brazil. Has it ever happened to you? Yeah, I mean, when you learn multiple languages, you will find that the ability to learn the next language depends on your experience with that language. And I always try to, like, when people challenge me to learn a language and recommend it based on all these linguistic things, they'd say, oh, you know, it has these 7 cases and it's got this really hard to pronounce thing. Then that, unfortunately, is not going to motivate me to learn the language. I'm going to be studying it in the books, and I'm going to lose any interest I have to continue that. So what needs to change is I need to have that personal connection. So I had a great positive experience in Brazil, but the reason I was able to learn languages after that is because I made sure I had some human aspect to learn it. So maybe in your case, if you're trying to study Polish, maybe you don't have enough contact with Polish people to give you that extra motivation. And especially if you are finding yourself going back to talking to Brazilians, then that's great. You're going to continue to improve your Portuguese. But with your Polish, try to find something fun, something that inspires you. Maybe, I always say, if you're still an absolute beginner, maybe pick up some comic books. Oh, sorry, my camera has stopped for a second there. I'll turn it back on. And sorry about that, everybody. Hopefully my sound is still coming through while my camera boots back up again. So, Holly, can you let me know if you're hearing my sound, and I'll just restart my camera software. You guys can probably still hear the yeah, okay, my sound's good. All right, so I just double checking when my video feed is coming through. And okay, sorry about this little pause, everybody. I will be bringing that feed right back in one moment. And the great thing is anyone watching this after the fact will, of course, be able to skip through this technical problem. So keep your questions coming. I'm going to be here until just before the end of the hour. And okay, so while my camera software is booting up again, I will take the next question. And that is from J Hope's Daydream. Okay, so this question, I know what I'm going to do with the camera. My software isn't working. I can add a new source. This is why you have these things ready to go at the drop of a hat. Okay, here we go. This isn't as flattering, but this is my backup camera. Okay, that's good enough. That's fine. Okay, so back to business. So are Asian languages harder to learn than Western ones? There's a story I like to share when it comes to this very big question, and it comes down to the core of my whole philosophy with language learning, and that's when I met a Spaniard once, and he was learning Japanese, and he'd also learned French in school, and he told me something that really caught me off guard at the time. He said that he finds Japanese easier to learn than French. And that's a very strange thing to hear, because you would expect Spanish and French are in the same language family. So why on earth would he find Japanese, that's so far away, easier than French? And the reason is, he told me that he just didn't care about French. He had to learn it in school, and he wasn't passionate about it. Whereas he watched a lot of anime, he found Japanese girls cute, so he had this completely different motivation, and said he's always dreamed of moving to Japan and living there. So this changes things dramatically, this human aspect of your motivation to learn a language. So for this person, learning Japanese was easier than learning French, even though French and Spanish are very close. Now, I do obviously agree that if you do a very purely and kind of, to be honest, inhuman side-by-side comparison in terms of list of number of common words, list of number of common, grammatical features, then of course you're going to find that languages that are in different families to yours are going to present more things you have to learn. And that's going to make them harder. The more things you have to learn, the harder it is. But then, if you don't have the motivation, then a language is going to be, or even a good language learning method, then it's going to be hard regardless. And I always tell people that relative to learning, say, Spanish was my first language that I learned like properly, I should say. And that was the hardest language for me. That was harder than learning how to get conversational in Mandarin. And this confuses a lot of people, but the thing is, when I started learning Spanish, I tried some very inefficient learning techniques. I kept doubting myself. I kept saying I'm a terrible language learner. They're all laughing at me, or they hate me when I try to speak the language to them. And this slowed me down. And then when I got to Mandarin, because that was like deep into my language learning journey, I had a process of avoiding English and intensively pushing myself up. And with the same number of hours put in, I was further along in Mandarin than I was when I started learning Spanish. So this is very, very important. Now, that being said, if you're equally motivated to learn two languages and one of them is further away linguistically, that is going to take you more time. That is obvious. It goes without saying, but the idea of Asian languages as just being harder, keep in mind, you can definitely make a list of reasons why language X is harder than language Y, but you can also make the exact opposite list. And this is something I've done in many blog posts. I've gone out of my way to explain why something like Hungarian. People always said Hungarian's the hardest language they'll ever learn. But then, the problem is they say that for every language. They say, a lot of French people will proudly say French is the hardest language, and, Chinese is the hardest language, and German is the hardest language. No, Russian is the hardest language. Everyone thinks every language is the hardest language. And when they try to argue the case, they obviously have a list of reasons. We've this many grammatical cases. Yeah, but we have this many tones, and that's fine. But you can also present the case that a language is easy. And if you look on my blog, I've got reasons why Hungarian is easy, reasons why Czech is easy, reasons why, and I do this for multiple languages. And it's not because I was trying to be arrogant. I was trying to kind of turn the conversation on its side and say, yeah, you can give me reasons why the language is hard, but here's reasons why it's easy. And that's important, Okay, so hopefully that addresses that question. And let's see what's next here. So Casey Brook on YouTube says, my mom's trying to learn German but can't get the throat sound. How would she be able to do it better? I think for specific sounds like that, definitely I always recommend people just look up on YouTube a video like how to get the German R, for instance, and a native speaker will, because I can try to explain it to you. But my German R is not perfect, so I would kind of mislead you if I was to suggest what you do. But like in general, any kind of guttural sound, and it's kind of like the sound you make when you're gurgling water if you're an English speaker, But again, try to see what you can find on YouTube, and then otherwise have a native speaker help you. I had a native speaker help me with multiple issues that I had in multiple languages. I had someone like train me for a long time to try to get the Spanish trilled R, and you know, a native makes a world of difference. So that's just something to keep in mind for that. Okay, so next, Dominica's excuse me. Do you watch the Eurovision Song Contest? I do whenever I can. It's hard in the States, especially with the well, no, I guess the time zone works for me, because if it's in the evening there, it's just in the afternoon here. But I always forget it's happening, even though it's a big event in Europe. It's no one really knows what it is here, because I live in NYC. So yeah, sadly, I miss out on some European events and stuff like that. Okay, Oliver on YouTube says, "Hey Benny, I'm going to work in Spain as a salesman, and my Spanish is not quite good yet. I understand a lot and can make my point, but of course I miss all important sales vocab. Where do I get it?" Okay, for sales vocab, I would say that there are multiple things you can do there. You can find a YouTube channel about marketing in Spanish, and just some basic search terminology. Like for instance, if you anyone watching this on YouTube right now, because I'm streaming on both YouTube and Facebook, if you're on YouTube and you go into your settings, you can change the language. I might actually be able to show you this if I zoom into my own YouTube settings here. Okay, no, I'd have to do a screen capture thing. I'll probably do that in a separate video so I can refer to it. So essentially, if you go into your YouTube settings and change the language that it's being searched through, then you're going to be able to find a lot of options for content to watch in that language. So I would search for key sales terms. I would search for channels that do that, subscribe to those channels, listen to them. Some of them provide subtitles, and you will hear the kind of words that come up very often. So that's good, because this is the spoken context, and that's the thing you're likely to use in real situations. So I recommend that. And then I would also say that if you find sales magazines, sales websites, then you'll start reading through, and just reading the specific content in that language will help you learn the words that are likely to come up. Okay, so next we have, and again we got another half hour, so you guys get your questions in, and I will try my best to answer as many as I can. And once again, thanks for watching this on, I'll be doing all my general language learning questions from now on my Fluent in 3 months YouTube channel. So that's different to Benny.tube, which is the Benny Lewis channel. And that Benny Lewis channel is where I'm going to be doing tomorrow a video on time management, and Saturday a video on Irish language, culture, and St. Patrick's Day. So definitely make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel so you never miss general language learning questions. And we'll be doing more language themes on the Fluent in 3 months channel, so I have more flexibility in the kind of topics I can cover on the Benny Lewis channel. Okay, so let's see. Okay, Greg on Facebook was asking, what did you have to do to move from intermediate to C2 mastery in Spanish? How long did it take, and how often were you practicing and studying? Okay, so quick background on my Spanish. I moved to Spain. I spent 6 months pretty much failing to learn Spanish. The approach I was taking just wasn't good. So I don't really count that towards the time I was intensively learning the language. But then the second 6 months I was in Valencia, I was getting out there and speaking the language as much as possible. As a beginner, speaking is what I recommend. Not obviously when you get to the C2 level, there's a lot more to it. But I was speak. And I think I would have gotten, if I had to guess, to maybe a B1 level by the end of my 6 months in Spain. And so, or perhaps A2, like a solid A2, low B1. And then from there, I think that I came back to Spain, and I had practice with Spanish, with my Spanish in other places, and I think by practicing it as I traveled with Spanish speakers, both from Spain and from Latin America, I got it to a more solid B1, creeping towards B2. And I think by the time I got to Salamanca in Spain, I would have been at a B2 level. So I had 3 months to switch my B2 to pass the C2 exam. So those 3 months were incredibly intensive for me. What I did was I was working as an English teacher, so that obviously did not help with my project. It did help with me being able to not die of starvation and have a roof over my head, of course. But I spent every other hour of every day entirely devoted to my project. So I was reading books in Spanish. I was attending classes with a teacher who was familiar with the exam. I was writing a lot of Spanish and getting that Spanish corrected. I was speaking it out and about, but I think the kind of spoken practice that you get as a beginner is great to get you to the intermediate stage, but it's not going to help you to progress like beyond that intermediate stage. The general conversations that you have just as you're hanging out with people. If you want to get to the C levels, you need to be having technical conversations. So when I was getting lessons with my private teacher, I wouldn't just be saying, so, how was your weekend? That we would be having like debates. She would be asking me to explain something very technical, maybe something related to, like, I was making YouTube videos at the time, so she'd ask me, you know, oh, how do you edit the video? So stuff like that. Or she would challenge me. And I know, like, more recently with my French, for instance, whenever I have a call with my French teacher, she would show me a YouTube video where people are speaking very quickly and talking about a very difficult topic, and I would have to, like, take a point of view and debate that point of view, essentially. So having way more complex discussions helps to push you beyond that. But ultimately, I think what helps best for me personally is to know I'm at a C2 level, is to take mock C2 exams and see where your weaknesses are, and then focus on those weaknesses. So I found that I actually did very well in the mock oral exam. So I needed to practice way more the other aspects of Spanish, and I had a teacher who guided me through that experience. And so that's kind of what I did, and ultimately when I sat the exam, I was successful. And I think what I should have done is I should have done that with my German. Should have done more, I think, more than one mock exam, and then I would have seen that my listening skills were definitely not up to par. And yeah, so that's kind of essentially it. I just focus on the exam, what the exam needs, and improve those aspects of my Spanish. And I did it over 3 months from what I would imagine I think was a B2 level, but that was 3 very intensive months. I think I worked maybe 5 or 6 hours a day, and then every other hour of every day was entirely studying or actively using my Spanish. Okay? All right, so next we have Melissa on Facebook. Any suggestions on getting past brain freeze when it comes to finding your words in the language you're learning? I find I understand what's being said to me, but struggle to find the words to respond and keep conversation going. Yep, this is something I mention often enough in my Q&As, that when it comes to the ability to understand the language, I think that comes a lot easier, because our tendency when it comes to repeating words is rote. So you might see, if you're learning, I don't know, like an example I always give is that if you're learning the Spanish word for beach and you see it's playa, and you would say to yourself, beach, playa, beach, playa, beach, playa, and you repeat over and over again. And it kind of works when you see the word then on paper, or someone says it to you and they're like, playa, and you're like, playa, playa, beach, beach, playa. Okay, I see. I know what he said. The problem is that's asymmetrical, because you'll recognize the word, you can't produce the word. So the way you need to produce the word is you need something way more solid to burn that word into your memory. And in that case, there's lots of things you can do. One of them is to use mnemonics. So, for instance, in that example, a mnemonic I came up with myself was I imagined, so playa sounds a little bit like player. And when I think of player, I think of like a cheesy pickup artist. So I imagined this Johnny Bravo with like, you know, combed back blonde hair, an overconfident guy, like strolling down a beach trying to pick up girls and getting slapped in the face. And this ridiculous image, I saw this guy who I imagined this is a player on the playa. And what that did is that meant that if the situation arose where I needed to say the word beach, then I would think, okay, beach. I did this. I remember I tried to learn this word, and there was, what was on the beach? There was a player, a playa. That's the word. And this kind of glue helps you. And it may seem cumbersome and way too much work to when I have to do this every time a new word comes up. But you'll actually find your skill to create these mnemonics gets better and better the more you try it. And you only need to do it a couple of times. Like I needed to do it with playa for the first while I was learning Spanish. But obviously now, as a much higher level learner, if I'm speaking Spanish, I don't have to think to myself, oh yeah, I need to say beach. What was that again? Because really, after 2 or 3 times of using a mnemonic, it's pretty much burned into your memory. And it just becomes a natural word for you that you're able to say as needed. So I would recommend mnemonics to help you for sure. Go to the website Memrise, MEMRISE.com. It'll give you lots of good inspiration for potential mnemonics. And then the other thing is making sure you're spacing your repetition of the word. So you can look into something like Anki, which is a flashcard app. And it shows you the word based on a frequency of when you're most likely to need to get reminded of that word. So I've written a few blog posts about this, so just look up spaced repetition and you'll see when I kind of discovered this myself. And hopefully it'll give you some inspiration for how to produce those words on command, even when you feel you kind of recognize them. And that for me is like, it's how we asymmetrically learn the words. Okay, so let's see next. So Nick Corpin on YouTube. I've been listening to a lot of mostly intermediate Spanish podcasts, and I've made a lot of progress. But recently I feel like I've hit a wall and I'm not comprehending as much. Any suggestions? Okay. Generally, when you hit a wall, when you hit a plateau, this for me very simply states that what you're doing doesn't work. It might have worked to get you to that point. And this is why I'm always telling people, speak from day one, speak from day one, speak from day one. That's my mantra when I start learning a language. But the thing is, that'll only get you so far. Generally, when I'm progressing in a language, the speak from day one method gets me up to intermediate, but then I'm at a plateau and I can speak all I like, but I'm not really improving my skills. And maybe the podcast that you're listening to did a great job to get you to your current level, but they're not helping you get beyond that level. So potentially you might have to increase the difficulty of the podcast, or if you're not understanding, then you might need to decrease the difficulty of the podcast. But then maybe it's something else. Maybe you need to get more actual live practice with a person, and you're kind of all overwhelmed and you've done more than enough podcast listening, and there's something else you need to do. And spoken practice is a great way to get that kind of interactive like use of the language. So I would say to mix things up. If you ever hit a wall or a plateau, then what you're doing needs to change. And this goes for if it's boring, mix it up. Find something else, some other method to get you beyond where you are. And that's what I would suggest. Okay. Ramses on YouTube. Can you suggest books for German grammar? Let me see if I can see it back there right now. No, it's not. I need to have my books easily accessible because I keep mentioning them in these videos. I believe it's Harrap's, Harrap, and Harrap's German. Now the problem is that is a very boring book to start with. Do not use that if you're a beginner, an A1, A2 level, because it's got no pictures. It doesn't have any complex dialogues. It's literally just a list of the rules. But I personally found it fascinating after I'd reached the stage where I got enough practice in German, I got enough exposure to German that I was ready to really get into fixing the, like, polishing the edges to make it like more correct, as it were. So I recommend that book. Okay, Jessica on Facebook, what's your favorite language to speak? Brazilian Portuguese. Simple answer. Lucia on YouTube, when you learn languages, is your goal to cover everyday conversational topics, or do you have different goals for languages? I have different goals, always. Depends on what level I'm at, what I hope to achieve in that language. So if I'm at higher levels, I won't be speaking so much. I'll generally be reading. Maybe I'll be getting practice with the teacher who's really pinning down the biggest issues I have in the language. But yeah, it depends. Depends on the language, my goal, my level, quite a lot of things. Okay. And sorry, I'm going to start skipping over some questions, but keep them coming. And I'm sorry if I missed your question today. I will be doing more of these live videos for general language learning questions, but on this channel, so make sure you click the subscribe button on YouTube, okay? On the Fluent in 3 months channel. So just spell that out, youtube.com/fluentin3, spelled out THREE, months. And that's the channel. Subscribe. It's almost at 10,000 subscribers. You guys can push it over. Okay, so let's see. Next one that's interesting looking. Ramses again on YouTube is asking, how do you identify sounds that are not in your mother language? Identifying them, I don't know if I would try to identify them. That to me is more like I'm deconstructing a language, as if I'm a linguist who's just discovered it. Like other people have done that work for me. Generally, any good language course will explain the unique sounds to that language. So I would just see what the courses are telling me, or I would just Google hard sounds in Spanish, hard sounds in German for English speakers. And just try to get like a direct answer from people who've done that work for you. If someone else has done the work for you, there's no need for you to like listen to ours and be like, oh, I don't know if that sound, because our own biases are going to kind of force us to not really appreciate the subtle differences in sounds. We have our own native like way of understanding things, and so I would see what work has someone else done, and then they will identify the sounds for you. Okay. So, let's see. So, Vladimir on Facebook. I moved to Germany when I was 23. I've been living there for 5 years. German is almost my native language with almost no accent. Very good, congrats. But I still think in my native Russian, and it's easier for me to do that than in German. So, right to replace my language if I really want to. My identity is German, my mindset is German, I want to be German. Very interesting question. Okay, so let me see. If I was trying to do that, I always like really try to get people to like question, like, is it really necessary to push yourself that far? Like, do you want to be a spy or something? But you have covered that doubt because you identify yourself as German. Okay, so if you want to think, you're currently thinking in Russian, you want to start thinking in German. I always tell people, if they ask me, oh, when do you start thinking in a language? Like, that's a natural thing that just happens and defines your language experience in some way. But I try to just force myself to do that. I would like have the inner dialogue in my head, and I would say, oh, tengo hambre, and I would just kind of tell myself that, and it's an unnatural thing to do initially, but then you get your momentum, and I have gotten myself to start thinking in the language, especially when I'm very much immersed in it, because I want to not be switching back to English, because I find that kind of I lose my momentum. I'm not able to use the language as well as I could if I'm like thinking in the language and then back to thinking in English. So I would recommend you force yourself to just use the language in your head as much as you can. But other than that, if Russian is easier for you than German, then maybe it's the context of how you use it. Like, even if you have an excellent sounding German, maybe the people closest to you that you tend to be more open with, maybe they are still Russian. So maybe if you have closer friendships in German and you express your hopes and dreams, then that can be what pushes you over the edge. Because if you're using the language in more professional contexts, I mean, it's very, very hard to know without knowing your whole life, essentially. But I would just try not to just wait for it to happen. See if you can, like, force your hand of trying to think actively in the language. If you find yourself thinking in Russian, then stop yourself and switch to Nein, ich will das auf Deutsch sagen. And just like really kind of keep your, like actively change how you think about it. And you might be able to make the switch that way, you know? That's the best quick answer I can give you now. So sorry about that. So let's see. Yeah, Dominikas, I could see that you're some of the comments have stopped on YouTube. I don't know why the comments have stopped. That's very strange. Okay. Comments stopped for 10 minutes apparently. Sorry, I've just noticed that. Now. Okay, so I don't know why the comments have stopped here. Let me just test that very quickly. Hello. Yeah, I can type a comment, but nobody else can apparently. What do you think, Holly, on that? Yeah. Okay. Sorry if your questions aren't coming through, everybody, for the last 10 minutes. Generally, the second half of questions are harder. Okay, Mateos just wrote a comment. Okay, sorry about that. That was very strange. But we're still getting all the questions over on Facebook, so I'll just kind of shoot ahead. And again, sorry for everybody for the last 10 minutes who wasn't able to comment on YouTube. 2 technical problems today for the price of 1. Look at that. Okay, so let's see. Over on Facebook, Barbara was asking, "Hi Benny, I grew up speaking Spanish, but have fallen out of practice in the last 15 or so years. I'm desperately trying to get it back, but I find it hard. It's like it's locked in a dusty vault in my brain. Any advice?" Yeah, I have advice for that, and unfortunately, I think when and I understand. I mean, I don't understand the level if you grew up speaking the language, but I do understand that the feeling that you are really good at a language and then you don't speak it for a while. It's frustrating when you try to start speaking it again and you forget certain words or you're hesitating a lot. And it's unfortunate, and that because of essentially our confidence and our need to express ourselves, some of us just feel so bad that we stop ourselves from continuing to speak. And then another opportunity comes up maybe a few weeks later, and the same thing happens over again. Because of our lack of practice, we fall short. We don't know a particular word. We feel very bad, and it's like all of these negative emotions come into it. So that means we leave it again, and I totally get that. It can feel like you, like you said, it's locked in a dusty vault, and you try to open it, but then it doesn't really work. Unfortunately, the only solution to that is you just have to give it a lot of actual real usage and time. And you can get to the stage you were very, very quickly, you know, not in a few hours, but maybe in a few days, maybe in a few weeks of actively using the language. You could potentially get it back to where you were previously. But if you haven't used it for 15 years, then you might need a couple of months to really get back to where you were. And that's fine, because a couple of months to get back to a very, very like an advanced, essentially native level Spanish, that's something that not a lot of people can do. So I know it feels like you should just be able to switch it on, but unfortunately, we need active practice in the languages. So I would just accept that your Spanish has kind of taken a little knockback and be okay with that. You know, be at peace with the fact that your Spanish is not where you want it to be, and then actively use it and you'll start to see the things that you've forgotten. You'll start to see, oh, I need to like learn this list of words or relearn it. And then before you know it, you'll actually be at a very high level again. You'll be confident again. And I think it's hard for people to break through that, because if you come from a very, very high level in the language and you try to use it and you don't have the high level, then you will feel bad about yourself, and that's kind of going to prevent you from trying to use it later. So unfortunately, you just have to push through. You have to decide that you are, it's okay if you suck in Spanish temporarily, you know? So I hope that helps. All right. So over again on Facebook, as I'm catching up, Ahmed said, how do I jump from intermediate to the advanced level in English? This is kind of similar to the question I was just answering, where I was giving the context of how I improve my Spanish from intermediate to C2. So I would recommend it for essentially any language that you might be learning. Just consider finding the C2 exam. So in English, this is done by the Cambridge Institute. And you don't even need to pay to sit the exam. Just download some mock exams and try to do one mock exam and see where you failed at it. Sometimes they give you an answer sheet so you can really test this. And then from there, you can put your effort into fixing those problems. And generally, when you want to be at an advanced stage, that means you can work professionally in the language. And that means you need to have practice doing things that are using the language at a professional level. So that's like using it in the real world. This is, you're way beyond, if you want to do advanced stuff, you're way beyond just, you know, swiping through apps to learn the language and just kind of picking a book up every now and again. You need to be actively using the language in complex situations. So that's what I would recommend in general to push your level from intermediate to advanced. Okay, David on Facebook, speaking with a native or fluent speaker, how do I keep the conversation in the target language? Several things you can do there. So this is something I have discussed a lot on the blog, and essentially when someone switches to your language, so in my case, if someone switches to English, I have to try and really understand why are they switching to English with me. And sometimes it's because I'm showing a lack of confidence and they want to help me. They don't want me to be looking like I'm suffering. And so because of that, they will switch to English because they're trying to help. So the way I solve that problem is I'm just trying to be more confident in the language. I know I gotta hesitate, I gotta think about what I'm gonna say, but I try to have a smile on my face. I try to do like weird dramatic pauses, you know, and I'd be like, I know. And I always tell people I kind of do it like Jack Sparrow would. So that's kind of the confidence thing. But then sometimes people just want to practice the language with you, and you just need to be firm and say, good for you, but I really, really want to practice my Spanish, my French, or whatever with you. Would you mind if we just stick in that language? And more often than not, people will say yes. And then if they say they really want to practice the language, then a lot of the tips that I give people, I've kind of always had this philosophy of it's better to like teach someone how to fish than hand them a fish. So whenever someone is like, I really, really want to practice English, and they're saying this to me in German or Italian or something, then what I'll do is I'll say, okay, let me give you some suggestions, and I'll give them tips for how they can learn languages. I'll tell them about italki. I'll tell them about places they can go that they're likely to find international, like tourists and Americans and so on. And I'll do all of that, but I'll do it in the language that I want to practice. So in a way, I'm kind of solving their problem for them. I'm giving them suggestions that can really help them, but I'm still getting my language practice. So it's a win-win in a way. Sometimes you do have to be firm, and there are other things to it. So I've written a couple of blog posts on this subject, but that's what I would recommend, to really think, why are they switching the language with you? And that's something that you can work around. So just 2 more minutes and I'm going to wrap this up, everybody. Sorry I didn't get to all your questions, but I'll do this again soon. Don't forget to subscribe, and then definitely check out my other channel for upcoming videos the rest of the week. So let's see, final questions. I would like to become an interpreter or translator. Do you think I should go to university specifically for it, or make it a major, or should I study at home through websites? A complex thing, but if you look up, sorry, that was Big Kevy on Facebook. If you look up how I became a translator, then you'll see my process to moving into translation professionally. And I'd say from there, if you want to do interpretation professionally, you don't necessarily have to study at university. So I studied electronic engineering, and then I learned, not from books, but I learned by doing like very poorly paid translation jobs, and then I worked my way up, and there was more to it than that. But essentially I was a specialized translator. So my undergraduate degree in engineering actually helped me find more translation work than, ironically, people who had studied translation in university, because they didn't have the experience in with specific engineering topics. So that's kind of one thing I would suggest. But of course, you could still study in university, and you'll be able to address a lot of things that people with like only specific knowledge of one field may not be able to address. It's a complex question, but I've written a couple of blog posts on that. And then finally, let's see, last question from Mateos, who was saying earlier that unfortunately you have to stay in bed a lot, and I'm sorry to hear that. So how do I find a passion in learning when, like, how do I not waste time, especially if I don't want to be stuck laying in bed? Okay, so for this, like, first, if you are stuck doing something and you find that your motivation is hard to get out of it, then rather than having too many barriers to pass, so rather than being like, I need to be across town speaking the language with people, maybe if you're feeling like stuck and you're lying in bed too much, maybe start something that you can do in bed. So it's like a very little effort to just like pick up a book to read, or pick up an app that you can swipe through as you learn a language, or pick up your laptop to watch some YouTube videos in the language. Something very easy, and that will get you started. And then from there, make the next step another one that's also slightly more difficult, but not too difficult, because I think that's the problem when we want to motivate ourselves to do things. We tend to set the bar a little too high, and we're like, oh, I need to like talk to multiple people, and I need to know all these words. And then when we try and we don't have the motivation to do that level of investment, then we feel bad and we feel like we're not even trying it after that. So I would do it in little steps, and I hope that helps out a bit. But when it comes to like project management and stuff like that, I'm going to talk about this a bit more tomorrow. So I might be able to give you more tips on that, like how to get into projects. So I know that I know it could be difficult. There's a very complex subject, but I hope that helps a little bit for today. But then tomorrow, join me, and I will be helping everybody with some things that I've been learning about managing your time and getting into new language learning projects. So that's tomorrow, and you can see that on the Benny Lewis channel. And again on Saturday, I'll be back for discussing Irish language culture and St. Patrick's Day. So everybody, thank you very much for joining me in today's live Q&A. Make sure you're subscribed and click the bell notification icon, and you won't miss these, and it'll be one of the first questions. And I know I had to skip over a bunch of the questions for the second half, but I would love to help you guys. If you're here earlier, once you see a notification, join in, ask a question. I can definitely get to the questions as they come up earlier. And yeah, thanks so much everybody for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Happy language learning.